Chapter 21. Once they were all back on deck, enjoying the glorious morning sunshine, Malou asked Damianos, "Could you just explain one thing to me?" "What's that?" Damianos queried, turning briefly in his seat at the wheel of the cruiser. Malou got up from her lounge chair and went to stand beside their cat. "If you were able to get Daniel out there in Iran in 1979 in the middle of the war, and he met this friend of my husband, why is it that you can't just transport us to the date and place where Dan is at the moment?" "Very good question indeed, Malou, but you see, Dan's friend didn't say where he came from or the date he left behind to rejoin Daniel in Tehran. Even if I had questioned him, I don't think he would be able to give me an answer." "You mean his memory was temporarily erased?" "I believe so, yes." "Not quite, Damianos," Daniel interrupted, coming up to join his mother. "A couple of times he mentioned that Dad was worried about me, so he must have had some memory of my father, didn't he?" Damianos nodded, keeping his eyes on the stretch of the ocean ahead of them. They were on their way to the Keys. "Yes, you're right, Daniel. Gustavo could remember your dad such as you do when he's around, but when Nicholas, that's the name of the messenger who's looking after Dan, by the way, was ordered to send Gustavo to Tehran, he obliterated the date and place from his mind." "Okay," Malou said. "But that still does not explain how you or this Nicholas person could not tell us where Dan is. Obviously you both know this by now, don't you?" "No, Malou. Each of us do not necessarily know what the other does." Seeing that both Daniel and Malou were a little lost at this point, Damianos explained. "You see, I know where we are at this minute and where we're heading, but I have no knowledge of what Nicholas knows. He, in turn, same as I do, can decipher or guess the path we've taken to join Dan, but we're not able to share this knowledge." "You mean you depend on God or Damien and Solangi for direction?" Daniel asked. "Each of us do, yes, son. Such as Damien and Solangi give you clues and directions as to what we should do next. So does Nicholas, where your dad is at the moment." "Does he have a book to guide him too?" Gabby piped up from behind the three. "I don't know, Gabby, but somehow I don't think so. Since your dad has fallen into his past by mistake and not by his own will, it's likely that he hasn't had the chance to revisit the house where his book is located." "But will he be able to remember what he learned during his first trip with me?" "I don't know, Malou. Perhaps he might be allowed to open a few doors into his future, but I couldn't be sure." Stefano was the last to come up to the wheelhouse. "Why is God playing games with us?" Everyone turned to look at the young man who'd stood his back against the back panelling. "What I mean is that God knows where Dad is, obviously, but why doesn't he just allow you," he directed his gaze to Damianos, "to transport us where he is now?" "Because, Stefano, I'm not able to do anything else than what I'm allowed to do. On the other hand, it is my experience that every accident has to turn out into a learning experience, which in turn will make you better human beings." "You mean like me going to war to teach me what I would be facing if I ever decided to enlist? Is that it?" "Yes, Daniel, that's exactly what I believe is happening now. You see, as you rightfully concluded, God knows exactly where your dad is, but nothing of what God does should be a waste. So I believe each of you will be facing an experience during this trip that will benefit you in the future." "And that includes me too, I suppose," Malou suggested, lowering her gaze. "Somehow I don't think so," Damianos replied, throwing her a smile. "In your case, you have lived unforgettable ordeals and events during your first time with Dan. These should be enough to guide you through your future once you and your family return to 2013. "I don't know, Damianos. All that is a blur at the moment. To tell you the truth, I'm only thinking of Dan and how lost he must be feeling." It was another Sunday at the beach for Dan and Gustavo. They had decided to spend as much time together as they could, given that the next day Gustavo was due to start his new job. They were on their way to get a drink from the vendor, standing on the sidewalk beside his cart when Dan noticed a 924 Porsche pulled up and stopped not 10 feet from him. "Wow, that's my sort of car," Dan exclaimed, staring at the magnificent vehicle. "If I had their wallet," Gustavo put in, chuckling, "I'll probably get myself one of those too." They watched as a tall man came out, and while he helped his wife out of the passenger seat, Dan stared. "I know them," he said to Gustavo. "I mean, I've seen them before. Somehow I met them." "You did? You do keep some rich company, don't you?" Gustavo looked at the couple and couldn't help but admire their handsome demeanour. "Dear Dan," the woman said, stepping toward the bewildered young man. "How good is it seeing you here?" "It sure is a pleasure to meet again," the man rejoined, a broad grin draping over his lips. "And you must be Gustavo," he added, extending his right hand for him to shake. "I'm very sorry, ma'am, but I don't remember where we've met," Dan blurted, quite embarrassed. Gustavo, meanwhile, shook hands with the man and fixed his gaze on him. "Same here, sir. I don't think I've met either of you before." Quite, the man said. So why don't we walk along the beach and have lunch together at the plaza? He nodded in that direction, and we'll explain our intrusion. Falling in step with the couple, Gustavo and Dan exchanged a questioning glance while Dan tried to retrieve any bits of information he would have on this striking couple from his muddled brain. "I know," Dan erupted, stopping dead in his tracks. "You're Solange and Damien, aren't you?" He shot a glance to Gustavo. "These are my guardian angels, Gustavo. They know everything about me." Damien guffed. "Right you are, Dan, and very good of you to remember." He bowed slightly to Gustavo. "We're delighted to meet you, Gustavo. We have been looking forward to meeting the man who's looked after Dan since he fell in the clearing." I don't really know. I mean, what do you say when you meet angels?" Gustavo was obviously taken aback by the sudden encounter. "I had no idea that it was possible. I mean, let me rephrase that." Solange giggled. "Yes, we both know what you mean, Gustavo. No need to rephrase." Her smile was mesmerizing. Gustavo's gaze couldn't leave the angel's face. Regaining some of his composure, Dan said, "But why have you come? Has something happened to Malou and the children?" Daniel shook his head as they resumed walking toward the Plaza Hotel. "No, Dan, nothing has, and nothing is likely to happen until they get here." "Why then?" "Your patience hasn't been tamed yet, has it, Dan?" "Oh God," Dan exclaimed. "Of course, the 12 Herculean tasks of the shepherd. I remember now." "Glad you do, son. But why don't we provide you two with a delicious lunch while Solange and I explain why we're here? Would that suit you?" He looked at Gustavo in particular. "Lead the way, sir. I'm all for a nice lunch any time. Thank you." Gustavo still couldn't believe what was happening, but he figured if God had decided that he should be in his good grace for a day, who was he to argue? After they had delighted in a 3-course meal comprised of soup, seafood, and a scrumptious dessert, Dan asked, "I know it's probably inconsequential to what brought the two of you here, but whose Porsche was that? The one that's parked in front of the hotel now?" "Yours," was Damien's one-word answer. Gustavo and Dan exchanged a glance and then stared at the angels. "Mine?" Dan blurted, incredulity written across his face. "Yes, Dan," Damien went on. "This splendid vehicle is yours. You have been restoring old cars for some time now, partly for the sheer pleasure of it and partly to earn some extra money for college." He let that sink in for a minute. "Your nickname is MacGyver, after a television character who had the knack for turning a dire situation into a way to escape his many troubles, thanks to his talent for fixing anything with whatever he found at hand." Dan had his eyes riveted on Damien's face. "How come I can't remember the things I did then?" He paused. "I remember what I went through with you two and Malou and Damienos after my skiing accident, but none of what you just told me has yet come to my recollection." "That's because your brain is still controlled by your body, Dan. If you recall, one of the tasks demanded acceptance of the situation in which you found yourself, and together with acceptance, Damienos forced you into bringing your brain back to controlling your body." "Yes, I remember that," Dan said, nodding. "It was not until I told my body to follow my orders that I was able to get up and walk again after he whacked me in the legs." "Precisely, Dan. In this instance, though, what you need to do is to cast your predicament aside, accept it for what it is, and take the pieces of the puzzle in your mind and match them one to another until the picture of your life is complete." "But the problem, as I see it," Gustavo put in unexpectedly, "is that Dan only remembers things, or your puzzle pieces, if you like, when his mind is triggered by one event or another, or by an image that means something, much like the Porsche you're driving." "Yes, Gustavo," Damien agreed. "But in order for these images to become the trigger, you need to be in front of them or search for them. Like what I did when I went to the naval base, is that what you meant?" "Yes, you were driven to go there because your mind was in control. You let it guide your steps. However, now you've become preoccupied by other matters which, although very important, have served as a shield in front of your memories." "Such as my going with his son to Tehran, you mean?" Gustavo asked. "Exactly like that, yes," Solange answered. "You see, both of you have now entered a new phase of your lives, and your mind, Dan, is waiting for Malou's arrival. You know she will be here soon, so your only preoccupation is waiting." "So what else could I do?" Dan asked. "I don't know what my future holds. I only know what I will be leaving as soon as she arrives." "Ah, yes, and perhaps that's where you need to re-examine your decisions. Those decisions that are leading you to accompanying your dreams." "You mean by going for the naval training to become a fighter pilot?" "Yes, Dan. You need to remember what happened for you to decide on that career choice." "But that was because of Professor Hugo. He was a captain in the Navy in Venezuela." "Precisely my point, Dan. You did remember an important fact from your past when you were presented with a similar eventuality." But I remembered other things as well, like me leaving Venezuela, my high school days, the college and my father's troubles. He paused. But wouldn't I remember all those things once I returned to my future? Solange and Damien turned to each other and nodded. Unfortunately, you will not remember much of your past to this date, Damien said. If you don't recall all of the events that furnished your life before you go back to your future. It's like not remembering when you first scraped your knees, Dan, Solange added. You need to remember what happened since infancy before you venture back into your future, I'm afraid. Since you wouldn't have any recollection of those experiences that have forged your life, you would be liable to make the same mistakes in your future. Dan was dumbfounded. He thought everything would be all right with his memory intact once he returned to his future with Malou and the 3 children. Will you help me? He asked in a whisper. And that's why we're here, Dan. And Gustavo, although busy with his new job, will assist you as well. Gustavo, who had been sitting beside Dan, passed an arm over his friend's shoulders, saying, Don't you worry, buddy. We'll have these memories of yours back in no time. That's a promise.